Welcome to Hope Tales, and where ordinary people face extraordinary moments and miracles unfold in the skies. The sky over the Indian Ocean was calm, almost painted in gentle blues, as Flight AR-709 cut through the early morning air. Inside the cabin, everything felt normal. Passengers sipped coffee, mothers rocked their children, and tourists pressed their faces against the windows hoping to catch a glimpse of sunrise. No one had the slightest idea that in less than 10 minutes, their routine flight would turn into a silent war against fate. Among the passengers sat 17-year-old Zane, a quiet boy traveling with his aunt. He kept his headphones low and stared out the window, lost in thoughts about school, responsibilities, and a future he wasn't sure about. He wasn't extraordinary. He wasn't trained. He wasn't even interested in the plane until destiny pulled him into a moment humans rarely survive. In the cockpit, Captain Harris had been flying for 22 years. Calm, experienced, reliable. But that morning, something felt off. A strange pressure behind his eyes, sweaty palms, a subtle dizziness that refused to fade. He tried to ignore it. Thousands of people depended on him every month, and he wasn't the type to show weakness. The co-pilot, First Officer Malik, noticed something wasn't right. But before he could act, the unthinkable happened. At 32,000 feet, the captain's vision blurred. His hands slipped from the controls. His head dropped forward. And in a terrifying, breath-stealing moment, he collapsed. The co-pilot panicked internally but forced his training to guide him. He tried to stabilize the aircraft, but the sudden shift in weight and controls made the plane tilt slightly to the left. It wasn't enough for passengers to notice. But it was the first signal of an unfolding disaster, a warning whispered through the steel body of the aircraft. In the cabin, Zane felt the change more than others. He always had a sharp sense for motion. The slight, unnatural tilt made him lift his head. The hum of the engines changed pitch. The overhead lights flickered once. The turbulence was too smooth, too controlled, like the plane was being pulled instead of flown. The seatbelt sign turned on. Some passengers assumed it was routine. But Zane felt something else, a strange silence, a pause in the air as if the plane itself was holding its breath. In the cockpit, the co-pilot attempted to call for backup assistance. But then another blow hit, an electrical glitch caused by the collapse incident. One screen blinked, then two. Then alarms flashed, bathing the cockpit in red. The aircraft was still flying, but the co-pilot was now trying to control an unstable system with a collapsing partner and failing instruments. He needed help. He needed someone to hold the yoke while he revived the captain or sent an emergency code. But he was alone, and the situation was falling apart. Back in the cabin, a flight attendant suddenly rushed past Zane's row, her face pale, her steps too fast to be normal. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Zane's heart began to pound. The tilt became slightly sharper. A tray rolled to one side. A baby started crying, sensing the tension adults couldn't yet understand. Then came the moment that shattered the calm completely. A sharp jerk, a sudden dip. The kind of motion that wakes passengers from sleep and makes them grab the armrests. Gasps echoed. The engines roared harder as the co-pilot fought to level the aircraft. But he was losing control. The plane was still in the air, but it was no longer truly flying. Zane stood up despite warnings. The air felt heavy, thick with fear. He noticed the cockpit door slightly ajar just for a moment. Before a flight, attendant hurried to close it. But in that split-second glimpse, Zane saw something that burned itself into his mind. The captain was slumped over, unmoving. The co-pilot was struggling alone, and the plane was tilting again. A flight attendant approached Zane's row, trying her best to maintain composure. But her trembling hands betrayed her. She whispered something to another crew member, her voice cracking. They were trying not to alarm the passengers. But Zane saw enough to understand one horrifying truth. The people in charge had lost control. He looked around, everyone helpless, unaware, trusting the system that was failing them. A child clutched her mother. An elderly man pressed his forehead against his seat. A girl in the aisle prayed under her breath. Desperation hung in the air like trapped smoke. Zane felt an overwhelming surge inside him, a mix of fear, instinct, and something he had never felt before. Responsibility. His mind raced. His father had been a small aircraft mechanic once. Zane had grown up around planes, listening quietly as technicians discussed parts, engines, controls. He had watched, learned, and absorbed things unintentionally. He knew just enough to understand what could happen next. A pilot down, a co-pilot overwhelmed, failing instruments, unstable controls. At 32,000 feet, even a small mistake could end 200 lives in minutes. Zane swallowed hard. He wasn't a pilot. He wasn't trained. But he couldn't sit while the plane slid toward disaster. Something in him, call it courage, instinct, or fate, pushed him forward. The attendants noticed him standing and told him to sit. But then another jolt rocked the plane, stronger this time. Screams erupted. Luggage shifted. A water bottle rolled down the aisle like a warning sign. Zane grabbed the seat in front of him to steady himself. He looked at the cockpit again. The door wasn't fully locked. Not anymore. The co-pilot was shouting inside, trying to manage everything at once. He was drowning in responsibility. He needed support. Someone to physically hold the controls, while he revived the captain or sent a distress call. Someone steady. Someone brave. Someone willing. Everything inside Zane trembled, but he stepped forward anyway. The attendants tried to stop him, but another violent shake made them lose balance. In that moment, Zane slipped past them and pushed the cockpit door open. And then everything changed. The roar of alarms hit him like a wave. The co-pilot's desperate struggle. The captain unconscious. The plane diving subtly. The world outside a blur of white clouds. Zane froze, but only for a heartbeat. Then, with trembling hands, driven by something greater than fear, he reached for the co-pilot. A teenager, a boy who didn't believe he could change anything, now standing in the heart of a dying aircraft. And the co-pilot, overwhelmed, exhausted, out of options, looked at him with a silent plea that needed no explanation. The plane needed another pair of hands. It needed him. And Zane, breath shaking, stepped toward the controls. Right at the moment, the aircraft dipped into its most dangerous descent yet. Inside the cockpit, chaos lived in every corner. Red lights blinked like frantic heartbeats. Warning tones pulsed through the cramped space, and the cramped air felt thick, humid, electric with fear. Zane stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the sudden shift from calm cabin to this storm of alarms. The co-pilot struggled with the controls, sweat dripping down his forehead, breath uneven. His hands trembled from the strain of fighting the descent and the panic of being completely alone. He needed help, any help, and in that moment, Zane wasn't a kid or a passenger anymore. He was simply the only person who had stepped forward. The co-pilot pointed toward the control yoke on the captain's side, urging Zane to grab it. The captain's limp body leaned heavily to the left, pulling the yoke with his dead weight. Zane's heart pounded so loudly he could hear it over the alarms. His legs felt weak, but he forced himself to move. He reached out, fingers shaking, and wrapped his hands around the cold, firm metal. The plane immediately responded. The tilt reduced, but only slightly. The descent slowed, but just barely. Zane felt the weight of the aircraft through the controls, the tension in the yoke, the subtle vibrations of a machine fighting against imbalance. It was like holding a living creature trying to slip away. His arms burned instantly. The co-pilot worked swiftly to disable the auto-throttle glitches while attempting to stabilize the pitch, but every second felt like walking along the edge of a cliff. The captain's breathing was shallow, almost invisible, his face pale. The co-pilot kept glancing at him, torn between two impossible tasks, saving the plane or saving the man beside him. Behind them, the flight attendants struggled to stay balanced. They stared, stunned, at the sight of a teenager in the cockpit, his shoulders trembling under pressure no child should ever have to bear. But there was no time to question it. The plane dipped again. Zane tightened his grip and leaned his body backward, trying to compensate. His arms strained as if holding a door against hurricane winds. He felt every vibration, every shudder, every small shift of the metal giant he was now partly steering. He remembered the things he'd watched in hangars as a child. Small planes, not these massive aircraft. How slight adjustments in pressure changed everything. How stability came from controlled breathing and steady hands. He tried to apply it even though his heart raced. The co-pilot finally managed to take temporary control of engine power, but the left engine readings flickered dangerously. Not enough to shut down, but enough to cause unpredictable imbalance. And with the captain unconscious, it meant the co-pilot needed both, hands and full attention on the throttle and navigation. He still had no partner. Except Zane. Zane's fingers throbbed. The yoke felt heavier by the second, as if the plane resisted him, testing his resolve. He wasn't strong enough. He wasn't trained. He wasn't supposed to be there. But fate doesn't wait for permission. It pulls the brave forward before they realize they're brave. A sudden burst of turbulence shook the cockpit, slamming Zane's ribs against the panel. His breath escaped in a painful gasp. Outside, thick clouds swallowed the aircraft, spinning white around the windows like angry storms. The altitude meter dropped rapidly. The co-pilot shouted instructions, trying to force Zane to understand through gesture and urgency alone. Hold steady, straighten the pitch, keep the wings level. Those weren't things Zane should have known, but something in him, some echo of years, spent around his father's tools and aircraft diagrams, helped him make sense of the chaos. He pulled slightly upward. The plane resisted. He adjusted to the right. The tilt improved, but the turbulence fought back. He was learning a dance meant for professionals. Mid-air, with hundreds of lives trembling behind him, the cabin felt the effects. Passengers clung to their seats, some crying, some frozen with terror. An infant wailed endlessly. A businessman clutched the armrest until his knuckles turned white. A mother held her sleeping son like she could shield him from gravity. Nobody knew what was happening, but every heart felt the truth. Something was terribly, dangerously wrong. Despite the fear, Zane pushed himself harder. His arms shook. His palms burned. Sweat dripped from his forehead onto the control panel. The co-pilot stabilized the flaps, buying them a few more precious seconds. The plane shuddered again. A long, violent growl of metal and wind, but Zane kept his grip steady. He was no longer thinking about himself, not about his fear, not about the impossible situation, just the people behind him, the children, the elderly, the helpless. The passengers who didn't know a teenager now stood between them and disaster. The co-pilot began attempting to revive the captain while giving Zane hand signals to maintain level flight. It was barely working. The captain's pulse was faint, his breathing shallow. He needed medical assistance and oxygen, but there was no time. The turbulence grew worse. Clouds thickened. The plane dropped again, this time harder. The oxygen masks deployed in the cabin, swinging wildly. Passengers screamed. A flight attendant stumbled forward as the plane plunged for 3 seconds that felt like a lifetime. Zane tightened his grip with every ounce of strength left inside him. He pulled the yoke upward with a desperate cry of effort. The plane leveled, but only barely. The descent slowed, but not enough. The co-pilot was torn. He needed to call Mayday but couldn't leave the controls. He needed to assist the captain but couldn't abandon the plane. He needed a second pilot. But fate had given him a 17-year-old, with nothing more than instinct and courage. Minutes felt like hours. The clouds finally thinned, revealing a clearer sky below. But the altitude had dropped dangerously close to a limit they couldn't afford. The ground wasn't visible yet, but Zane could feel the pressure of height closing in around them. His muscles trembled violently. He could barely keep his arms steady. The co-pilot adjusted the trim to ease some weight from Zane's shoulders, but the plane's instability made everything unpredictable. The captain exhaled shallowly, unconscious, adding a silent, haunting urgency to the confined space. Zane's vision blurred from exhaustion. He wondered if he could hold on long enough. He wondered if this was how stories ended, quietly, painfully just before the miracle. But something deep inside him refused to break. Not yet. He tightened his grip, pulled with everything he had left, and felt the plane respond ever so slightly. Just enough to keep them alive a little longer. Just enough to keep hope breathing. Just enough to give fate one more moment to change everything. And then, just as the descent slowed and a fragile stability returned, the co-pilot glanced at the navigation screen, his face turning pale with a new kind of fear. Something was ahead. Something they could not avoid. Something no one had prepared the teenager for. A storm wall, massive, violent, and directly in their flight path. Zane's exhausted eyes locked onto the massive shadow forming ahead of the aircraft. What looked like a dark curtain stretched across the sky, towering cumulonimbus, clouds rising like walls of night. The storm churned with violent flashes buried deep inside its core, each burst casting a brief, eerie glow across the cockpit. The co-pilot stared at the radar, disbelief written on his face. They were too low, too unstable, and too close. There was no safe way around it. The plane was gliding toward the storm like a leaf drifting toward a waterfall. Zane felt the air thicken again, the kind of silent pressure that precedes something catastrophic. The turbulence began almost instantly. Not a small shake, not the gentle bumps passengers laugh off, but a violent, bone-rattling jolt that threw loose items off shelves and sent a shiver through the aircraft's entire frame. Passengers cried out as overhead bins shook. A water bottle bounced down the aisle. The cabin lights flickered. The baby who had been crying earlier fell silent from fear. Zane tightened his grip on the yoke until his knuckles whitened. Every muscle in his body felt stretched beyond limit. His shoulders burned with hot, pulsing pain. Yet the storm ahead promised far worse than exhaustion. The co-pilot wrestled with the navigation system, trying desperately to angle the plane into the least destructive path. But the turbulence grew stronger, pushing them from side to side like a toy in a giant's hand. The first impact of the storm hit like a hammer. A vertical drop, a sudden stomach-wrenching fall, the kind of descent that steals breath and steals hope. The cabin filled with screams. Zane's heart slammed against his ribs. His vision blurred for a second as the force pressed him deeper into the seat. The plane shook violently, the wings groaning under the stress. Lightning crackled across the clouds outside, illuminating the cockpit in icy flashes. He felt powerless, but he couldn't let go. He couldn't fail, not with hundreds of lives behind him. The co-pilot tried stabilizing engine output, but every adjustment was swallowed by the storm's fury. The aircraft lurched upward, then sideways, then dipped again. Wind currents slashed at the fuselage. The altimeter needle bounced wildly. Zane's arms trembled uncontrollably. For a moment, his grip loosened, but he forced himself back. Teeth clenched, breath shaky. His mind raced through every memory of his father's lessons, every fragment of knowledge gathered from those long afternoons in the hangar, when he had quietly observed mechanics and pilots. Planes hated sudden movements. Planes needed gentle corrections, but storms didn't care. The co-pilot gestured sharply. Stay steady no matter what. Zane understood. He tried to keep the wings level, even as the storm tried to rip control away from him. The aircraft vibrated violently, metal moaning like it might tear apart. A sudden explosion of light from outside signaled a lightning strike nearby. The sound came a moment later, deep, booming, powerful enough to make several passengers cover their ears. The cabin lights flickered again, then steadied weakly. A faint smell of burning electronics drifted through the back of the plane, though nothing critical had failed yet. The captain still lay motionless, his shallow breaths overshadowed by the roaring storm around them. The co-pilot checked him again, urgency in his every movement, but the captain didn't stir. He needed medical attention, oxygen, treatment, but survival came first. The plane had to make it through the storm. Zane felt the aircraft hit an updraft, an invisible elevator that launched them upward. With brutal force, his body crushed back into the seat. The yoke fought against him, but he held on. Passengers were lifted from their seats for a moment before slamming back down. The attendants barely stayed upright, clinging to anything they could grab. Then the reverse happened. A downdraft hit. The plane plunged like a falling stone. Oxygen masks swung wildly. Luggage slammed against overhead bins. A coffee cup flew past Zane, shattering against the cockpit wall. He heard people behind him crying, praying, whispering to themselves. The human sound of fear filled every corner of the aircraft. The co-pilot managed to regain partial altitude control, but the storm wasn't done. The next gust of wind struck the right wing, lifting it dangerously high. The entire aircraft tilted sideways, almost enough to tip. Zane leaned his entire weight into the yoke, fighting the tilt with every last bit of strength. His arms screamed. His back felt like it might snap, but the wings slowly returned to level, shaking violently. He gasped for breath, chest heaving. Lightning split the sky again, illuminating something terrifying. A dense core of storm clouds straight ahead, swirling like a black vortex. If they entered it at this altitude, the plane wouldn't survive. The co-pilot pointed sharply downward. Zane had to help angle the plane slightly below the worst of the turbulence. Not a dive, just enough to slip under the deadliest part. But with their altitude already low, it was like walking on a thread between sky and disaster. Zane adjusted the yoke downward carefully. The storm resisted, throwing crosswinds at the plane, but the angle shifted. The nose dipped slightly. The co-pilot gave a brief nod. Good. Keep it steady. More turbulence slammed into them. The plane rattled. The sound of metal stress echoed through the cabin. Zane's grip was slipping again. His muscles were failing. Fatigue washed over him like waves, but fear kept him conscious. He couldn't brake. Not now. The storm's edge came into view, dark clouds thinning, sunlight peeking behind them. But between the plane and the exit lay one final burst of furious turbulence. A final test. A final strike. The co-pilot braced himself. Zane inhaled shakily. The plane surged forward. Shaken, tossed, battered, until the final impact of turbulence slammed into them like a physical blow. The aircraft jerked so violently that the co-pilot hit the side panel. Zane felt the yoke twist sharply under his hands. For a terrifying moment, he nearly lost control as the plane dipped and rolled sideways. Passengers screamed as the aircraft tilted dangerously. Zane's vision tunneled. His arms felt like rubber. His chest burned. But something deeper inside him, something made of instinct, courage, and a desperate refusal to let go, kept his hands locked around the controls. He pulled back, steadying the roll. He leaned right to fix the tilt. He fought the wind like an athlete fighting exhaustion. And slowly, painfully, the plane leveled. The turbulence began to fade. The thunder softened. The clouds thinned. A faint glow of sunlight filled the cockpit. The storm was behind them. But the danger wasn't over, not even close. The co-pilot looked at the navigation screen and froze. They had lost critical altitude. They had drifted off course. The captain remained unconscious, and fuel readings flashed low. Ahead of them lay miles of open sky, but no nearby airport, and the plane needed a place to land, soon, before gravity and fuel made the decision for them. The storm faded behind them like a closing nightmare, but the sky ahead didn't bring comfort. It stretched out wide, empty, a silent reminder that survival was still uncertain. The plane had lost critical altitude during the violent turbulence. The engines hummed unevenly. The captain remained unconscious, and the navigation screen showed a truth that tightened every muscle. Inside the co-pilot, they had drifted miles off their original route, and there was no immediate airport nearby. Zane felt the weight of the moment settle over the cockpit. His arms still trembled from the fight through the storm. His palms were raw, fingertips numb from gripping the yoke with everything he had. The adrenaline that had carried him this far was fading, leaving exhaustion in its place. But he couldn't rest. Not yet. The co-pilot scanned every frequency, trying to contact any airbase, any regional airport, any emergency strip within reach. Static filled the radio. Their altitude had dropped too low for long-range communications. They were alone in a sky too big, in a machine too damaged. Behind them, the cabin was filled with silence, a silence made of fear, hope, exhaustion, and prayer. Passengers sat with oxygen masks hanging around their necks, holding hands with strangers, clutching their loved ones like fragile lifelines. The plane dipped again, not because of turbulence, but from fuel imbalance. The left engine, which had been flickering since the captain collapsed, now sputtered with a hesitant groan. The co-pilot reacted instantly, adjusting power, trying to keep them steady. A warning light blinked. Fuel low, odds lower. Zane swallowed hard. He wasn't a pilot. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be holding hundreds of lives in his trembling hands. But life doesn't choose heroes for their training. It chooses them for their courage. The co-pilot pointed to the horizon. Mountains in the distance. Flatlands closer. A thin river cutting across green and brown terrain. And, just barely visible, a narrow stretch of land that might be flat enough for a risky emergency landing. It wasn't an airport. It wasn't safe. But it was their only chance. Zane's heart thudded painfully as he nodded. His breath trembled. He didn't know how to land a plane. Not a real one. Not a commercial giant with failing instruments and low fuel. But he understood one thing. If he didn't try, no one would. The co-pilot began preparing for the descent, adjusting flaps, recalibrating throttles, running emergency checklists as fast as his shaking hands could manage. Zane took deep breaths, struggling to keep the plane level. Every dip felt like a warning. Every shudder felt like regret waiting to happen. They inched closer to the open field below. It looked flat, but from above, every detail was uncertain. There could be rocks, ditches, trees, but hope doesn't come with guarantees. It comes with choices. The co-pilot signaled for Zane to steady the nose. He complied, pulling gently, feeling the plane respond. His arms felt like lead. His chest felt tight, but he held on. The landing gear wasn't certain to deploy. The storm had rattled the aircraft badly. The co-pilot hit the control. A grinding noise echoed. Delayed, painful, but then the landing gear locked in place. A ripple of hope moved through the cabin when passengers felt the slight shift beneath them. Some cried softly. Others pressed their hands together. A few whispered silent thanks. The plane approached the makeshift landing area, altitude dropping. Speed still high. Zane forced himself to focus. Everything he'd observed about landings on small aircraft and simulators played inside his mind like a fast-forwarded memory. Keep the nose steady. Don't let the wings dip. Reduce speed gradually. A warning chime echoed, fuel critically low. The engines whined. The co-pilot communicated through gestures, trusting Zane more than he ever imagined he could trust a teenager. The ground drew closer. Fields rushing upward. Wind howling. Flaps extended. Zane pulled the yoke slightly upward at the right moment. The nose lifted. The wheels hovered inches above the ground. The first contact was rough. A heavy jolt shook the aircraft, throwing passengers forward against their belts. The second impact was worse. A tire bounced. The wing dipped dangerously to one side. Zane fought the yoke, shouting in silent desperation inside his mind. The plane skidded, throwing dust and debris behind it. Wheels screeched. Metal groaned. The co-pilot cut the power, trying to control the deceleration. The aircraft plowed across the uneven ground, rattling violently, but the wings held. The fuselage held. And slowly, painfully, the plane slid to a grinding halt in the middle of the vast open field. Silence. A silence so deep it felt unreal. Zane's hands slipped from the yoke as his strength finally gave way. His entire body trembled with exhaustion, shock, and disbelief. The co-pilot exhaled with a trembling chest, overwhelmed with relief and gratitude. He checked the captain again, still unconscious, but breathing steadily now with more stability. The cabin erupted, not with chaos, but with emotion. Passengers sobbed. Some cheered weakly. Some reached for strangers' hands. Flight attendants collapsed into seats, crying tears that were equal parts relief and disbelief. A boy, a teenager, a passenger with no obligation to step forward, had saved them all. The co-pilot looked at Zane with eyes full of gratitude, awe, and something deeper, recognition that fate had brought the right person at the right moment. Rescue teams arrived almost 40 minutes later. Paramedics rushed to the captain first, stabilizing him before airlifting him to a nearby hospital. Passengers exited the plane slowly, many stopping to look back at the aircraft that should have been their tomb, but became their miracle. Reporters came. Air traffic controllers came. Investigators came, and every story had one name whispered with disbelief. Zane, a teenager who shouldn't have been in the cockpit. A teenager who shouldn't have understood the controls. A teenager who shouldn't have been able to fight a storm. A teenager who shouldn't have been able to land a plane. But he did. Not because he was trained, not because he was chosen, but because in the darkest moment he refused to sit down. Months later, when the captain recovered, he asked to meet the person who saved his crew and passengers. And when he saw the shy boy standing in front of him, eyes down, hands tucked nervously behind his back, the captain felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. He placed a hand on Zane's shoulder, eyes wet with gratitude. And without speaking a single word, he conveyed the truth. Heroes aren't born in uniforms. They're born in moments. And Zane, the teenager who took control at 32,000 feet, became a story the world would never forget.